This film begins when a man named Tom and his wife named Julia and their two children, Casey and Ben, are enjoying their summer vacation on a ship in the middle of the Caribbean Ocean. At that time, Tom was teaching Ben how to use a fishing rod and Casey was busy with her cell phone. Julia tried to swim, but after a while, for some reason, she suddenly started to be dragged by the current, which made her further away from the ship. So Tom immediately turned on his boat to pick up Julia, who was almost drowning. Julia then explained to Tom about what she had just experienced before. Tom thought that it might be a whirlpool. She finally told everyone not to swim carelessly, so that such an incident would not happen again. Long story short, when night came, Tom's family began to celebrate Ben's 13th birthday, where Tom gave a gift in the form of a new gaming laptop, but Julia reminded that Ben should not use the laptop to play games continuously, because Ben also had to use it to study. Casey also gave Ben a gift in the form of a masked Medusa, which may be used to participate in the Halloween event. While Julia, the mother, gave a gift in the form of a bracelet made of sea stones that is currently trending among teenagers. They then took a picture together, and after the event was over, Casey also tried to contact her boyfriend who was in the city, but for some reason her boyfriend said that there was a strange storm that was very terrible, which made their connection suddenly cut off. Not long after, they started to hear a strange sound from outside the ship. Then when they checked it, it turned out that the sound came from a whale that was passing around the ship, which made them panic because one of the giant whales accidentally hit their ship. Worried that their ship would be damaged, Tom also tried to dive into the sea to check it. Is the condition of their ship okay? But when Tom returned, he had a pretty bad injury on his left arm. It turned out that Tom accidentally poked ship propeller. Tom said that their ship was slightly damaged by the impact caused by the whale, and to prevent the damage to the ship from getting worse, Tom finally told Julia to immediately contact the beach staff to send help to them. Even so, they had difficulty in contacting the beach officials because their signal was interrupted. And after Tom counted the food supply, he said that they still had supplies that could be used for the next 4 days. So they still had time to wait for the ship that might pass around there. Not long after, suddenly they heard a strange sound from outside the ship, but this time the sound was not from a whale, but some meteors that began to fall near their ship. So Tom was finally forced to turn on his boat so that they could stay away from the meteor. Without realizing, it turned out that the object that fell near their ship was not a meteor, but like a plain shrapnel that had just burned. And because Tom had turned on his ship, the damage to the ship's engine is now getting worse. So they couldn't turn on the ship anymore. Not only that, the sea that was previously very calm suddenly began to turmoil. Even Julia also started to have nosebleeds for no reason. It indicated that the situation there was not okay. Until finally Tom told everyone to immediately wear a float. Short story: the next day, when Tom and the others just woke up from sleep, how surprised they were. The ship they were on was now on the mountain, in the middle of a very wide dry plain, whereas before they were still in the middle of the sea. At first they thought that they were stranded on an island, but after Tom checked their location, he said that they should still be in the middle of the ocean, which indicates that they are not currently stranded, but seawater that suddenly disappeared mysteriously, while the vast land is the bottom of the ocean. In addition, Tom also realized that the compass that should point to the north has now turned to the south. So there is a possibility that the Earth's plate has just undergone a massive change, which causes changes in the land around the world. As happened in the 2012 film, it seems that the change in the Earth's plate makes the plains in the sea rise upwards, which explains why the seawater suddenly disappeared. But even so, Tom is more worried about the people on the land, because it is possible that the whole land is now changing, become a sea that can cause everyone to die. Hearing that, Casey could only cry because she didn't know if her boyfriend was okay now, while Ben was actually having fun flying a balloon while dancing on the rocks, because he was a young man who didn't really care about what was happening around him, even though the world was at the end of the world. Not long after, Tom suddenly got a radio call from a man named Now, a small submarine captain who also managed to survive the mysterious disaster, because he was in his submarine when the seawater began to disappear. In addition, Now also said that all his communication with the people on the ground had now been cut off, which made them unable to ask for help. But there was one more thing that made Now a little afraid, namely if the Earth's plate began to move again, there was a possibility that the seawater would return. Hearing that, Tom planned to go to Now's place, because his ship was now badly damaged, and the ship would not be able to survive if the sea began to return. But there Now said that his submarine could not accommodate everyone, so Tom asked Now to bring his 2 children only. After checking the coordinates of Now's location, Tom estimated that the distance between their location and Now's location would take about 2 days if they walked, which made them have to get ready first before going on a fairly long trip. Short story: the next day, when Tom was observing the surrounding situation, suddenly he saw a man walking with a black dog, and it seemed that the man named Joni was injured, so Tom tried to approach Joni while offering his drinking water. At first Joni received help from Tom, but without realizing it when Tom was careless. Suddenly Johnny immediately attacked Tom, even he stabbed his gun at Tom, until Tom died. While Julia, who saw the incident, immediately returned to the boat and told the children to hide immediately. Then when Johnny managed to get into the ship, he tried to find the whereabouts of Julia, who was hiding outside the ship, and at the same time Julia also managed to defeat Joni's dog, who tried to attack her, which made Joni very angry after she found out that her dog was gone. Not long after, Joni finally managed to catch Julia, but when he was about to do something to Julia, suddenly from behind Casey immediately fired a flare gun at Joni, until he accidentally set the ship on fire. And not long after Julia finished taking their belongings, the ship finally exploded. There they had time to hug the body of the father, who is now dead, but without realizing it turned out that Joni managed to survive the explosion. So Julia also told her 2 children to leave from there immediately, before Joni succeeded in catching them. Long story: after they walked quite far, Julia told her 2 children to rest first. While she tried to find out where Now was, Casey had time to blame Ben, because there was a possibility that the psychopath came to them because he saw the balloon that Ben flew earlier. Even so, Julia tried to calm Ben, that this was not her fault, and she told her 2 children not to fight and blame each other. While traveling, Ben had found a fish, the shark, that couldn't move anymore because of the lack of water. Then when Julia looked at the back, how surprised she was because Joni was still chasing them. So she told her 2 children to run immediately before Joni managed to catch up with them. Then when they had walked far enough, Julia told Ben, who looked exhausted, to drink first. But because Casey didn't close the drinking bottle tightly before, the water in the bottle seemed to leak until there was little water left and not enough for the 3 of them. Casey and Julia had a fight with each other because of Casey always blamed someone and never wanted to apologize, even though he was also wrong. But in the end they made up and continued their journey again. When the day started at night, they managed to find a plane wreck that was already filled with rust, and because they had no place to take shelter at night, they were finally forced to hide there while waiting until the next day. While on the plane, Key said he still didn't believe that his father had now passed away, and to comfort her 2 children, Julia tried to tell past memories about how he met Tom. That day when Julia was still 22 years old, Julia, who was a doctor, suddenly got a patient who was none other than Tom, who was experiencing a critical condition because his diving equipment was leaking when she was doing research on the sea coral, until finally Tom was treated in the hospital for 3 days. After Tom was discharged from the hospital, for some reason, suddenly Tom came back to see Julia while bringing a giant flower bouquet, which made Julia surprised, and since then Julia and Tom started dating until they finally decided to get married. As long as he was alive, Tom often told them that every problem would have a solution if they wanted to work even harder. So Julia asked her 2 children to work together and not blame each other again, so that they could survive this incident. Long story short, when Casey was urinating, without realizing it, suddenly Joni came and was about to attack her, but Julia managed to stop it. There Julia also vented all her anger on Joni because she had made her beloved husband die. The next day, when Julia and her 2 children were about to leave from there, they were also confused with what happened to Joni's dead body, because his body was now filled with tears as if it had been torn apart by a wild animal. That makes them have to be careful, because they still don't know what animals are roaming around there. Then after they walked quite far, I don't know why Ben suddenly started to act very strangely. He even immediately dipped his face into a puddle of water, because Ben turned out to be so badly dehydrated that he thought that the puddle was a puddle of clean water. Even so, Julia and Casey tried to strengthen Ben. But because the weather was so hot, they finally decided to rest first. They found that there were many used chairs scattered around, and they made a resting place from the piles of chairs. Long story short, when the night began, Julia suddenly woke up. She heard a strange sound that originated not far from where they were. But after she checked where the sound came from, she realized that they were being stalked by wild animals, so she immediately told Casey and Ben to leave from there. In a hurry, they tried to escape to the direction of a cargo ship. There they met several crew members who immediately entered the container, because they were afraid of the beasts that were chasing Julia and her 2 children. And in the end, Julia told her 2 children to immediately climb onto the container before the animals attacked them. It turned out that the beasts that had been chasing them were not wild animals such as wolves or something like that, but thousands of hungry sea crabs that directly attacked the crew inside the container. And the incident made one of Julia's legs suffer a serious injury due to hit by crab bite. Not long after, when Julia woke up from a faint, she realized that her 2 children were no longer there. And when she tried to check into the container, how surprised she was, because all the crew in the container had now died with torn bodies. In the end, Julia managed to find Casey. Casey said that she and Ben had just sought help, but because they could not find anyone, they were finally forced to take shelter in the container first while waiting until the storm subsided. Julia tried to close her wound by burning gunpowder, so that the wound would not get worse. And after the storm subsided, they took all the supplies owned by the crew, including drinks and weapons. In addition, Julia also managed to find a walkie-talkie. And when she entered Now's radio channel, she finally managed to contact Now. Now said that their location was now close enough that he would fire a flare so that Julia would know where she was. After Julia managed to find Now's whereabouts, she and the children rushed to go there. But even though Now's place was not too far away, it was quite difficult for them to get to that place because they had to go down some very steep cliffs. Long story short, when they were passing through the cliffs, I don't know why suddenly there was a tremor that was quite vicious that it made the rocks there start to fall and almost hit them. But luckily, they managed to survive the incident. Unfortunately, Julia was separated from her children because the rocks made her trapped between very high cliffs. So Julia told Casey to immediately take Ben to the place before the seawater returned, because there was a possibility that the vibration was a movement from the Earth's plate. At first, Casey said that she couldn't leave her mother like that, only because she didn't want to lose her mother like when she lost her father. But Julia said that if they stayed there, then they would all not survive. And in the end, Casey was forced to obey her mother's words. After they passed the cliffs, Julia and Ben finally managed to find Now's submarine. But without realizing, it turned out that Now was now seriously injured because he had been attacked by bad people like Joni, who tried to steal his submarine. Realizing that, Casey said that he had to pick up his mother because his mother was a doctor, which might can treat Now's wounds. And before leaving, Ben had time to give his bracelet to Casey, hoping that Casey could bring his mother back alive, because the bracelet was a lucky charm. On the other hand, when Julia was looking for another way out of there, suddenly she realized that the crabs began to come to eat her. It made Julia forced to shoot the crabs even though she only had a little ammunition. Then when her bullets ran out, Julia gave up. She even began to think that she would meet her husband soon. But suddenly Casey came to save the mother, so Julia couldn't show her weak side in front of her daughter, and in the end Julia tried to grab Casey's hand, and finally she managed to get out of the cliff. Without lingering, they immediately went to the submarine because the crabs started to chase them. And after they managed to get on the submarine, they did not have time to save Now, who was seriously injured at that time. So Now was immediately attacked by the crabs. Julia then told the children to immediately get into the boat, while she tried to shoot at the crabs that tried to get on top of the submarine. Then when Julia had entered the ship, they were scared because millions of crabs began to swarm their submarines. At the same time, suddenly a giant wave began to come, which indicated that the vibration of the Earth's plate before making the planes there now fall below the sea surface. And when the waves hit their submarine, they circled uncontrollably until Julia began to dreaming about their past. Julia did not expect that the holiday that they previously did to celebrate Ben's birthday while having fun turned into a very scary nightmare. Even Julia also lost the man she loved the most. At first, they all thought that they would not survive the great shock, but after they woke up from a fainting, Julia realized that their submarine seemed to be stopped by something, so they decided to get out of the submarine. Long story short, when they managed to get out of the submarine, how surprised they were because they finally made it on land. But unfortunately, almost the entire city has now been destroyed by the terrible disaster that happened before. It seems that the city has just sunk to the bottom of the sea, so it is impossible for someone to survive the terrible disaster that has made the city became a poor paranda like today, which indicates that Julia and her 2 children are a small part of the people who managed to survive the disaster, and then the film is finished.